Three really good questions. While I'm thinking about the other two, I'll take the middle one first, about from the US citizen. There's an element of this which is analogous, not directly analogous, at least in part, to the construction of the European single market, where you're talking about now you've brought together 28 countries, 28 very different countries, together into a single market. Does it work perfectly? No. But to an extent, we do have a voice, and yeah, well, most people say we have a voice. Everybody, to an extent, there is a voice. There is a democratic process. It's not perfect, but I would still maintain there is something there that can be drawn upon for creating an EU-US relationship based on shared values.
Rich white man's club.
Yes, thank you. Rich white man's club. So it's a good question. I mean, I slightly feel in answering that you almost kind of you can't win this one. If you either you want to have high standards and protecting your own citizens, then you're excluding somebody else, or you don't want to have high standards and then you're being more inclusive. I'm not quite sure where the right line is to this. I think that one thing I would say is that where you are having a larger market, a larger single market, which you can import to, that does have a potential benefit for other economies that are not part of that market. Where you have that standard, is it so wrong to have a gold standard to aspire to? I'm not completely sure that is the wrong thing to do. But it's not. I have to confess, I have colleagues who are particularly experts in these questions, which I myself am not, and I think it is a very interesting question, and I will go back and ask them further about this. And the final one, limiting the hegemony of the US. Do I have any examples? No, not yet, because I'm going to pick up a point that you made earlier, that I've seen lots of text and I'm not sharing it with you. I haven't actually seen lots of text. There are the beginnings of pages of legalese that don't really say anything at the moment. There's no huge hidden text that you haven't seen. Limiting the hegemony of the US. Well, actually, I think the whole agreement, if you're saying that there are certain areas which we agree to cooperate with you and give your businesses a larger single market, and there are certain areas that we don't, implicitly, therefore, those areas that you don't, for example, GM foods, say that's not included, you are limiting their hegemony, because you're saying, we've had the opportunity to sign up to your standards and we've rejected it in these cases. We've accepted it in these cases, we've accepted that we have a similar standard, but in these cases, we don't agree with you. So I think you do then have an EU that's confident and says, no, we believe in our values, these are them where we can agree, we will do, but where we can't, then the US is on its own. You can't count on EU support. That's my answers, but
Okay, thank you very much, David. Do you want to come back on any of those, Polly?
Yes, sure, thank you. I wanted to pick up a couple of points. On the question about being alike more than we realise, David talked about how similar our regulatory standards are, and that in some ways the EU is more highly regulated and has higher standards, in some ways the US. There are a number of specific areas where the EU consistently has higher standards, and these are many of the areas that campaigners have been concerned about, and I'll list them for you. So we have genetically modified organisms, banned in the EU, a clear target for US agribusiness companies. Whether they get access or not, we don't know yet, because the negotiations aren't concluded, but there's a clear difference on GMOs. There's a clear difference on the hormones that are allowed in beef. A clear difference on what chemicals are classed as toxic in the EU and which chemicals are classed as toxic in the States. And that's because we have a different scientific test. In the EU we have the precautionary principle, something we should be very proud of, where you have to prove that something is safe before it can be used. In the US you have to prove that it is harmful, and that's a much lower test. And the other big area where we have different standards is on climate change, all areas that people are very concerned about with the TTIP negotiations. And then in terms of alienation, a question that was raised, I think, and this comes back to the dramatic changes we've seen in the international trading environment. So The EU and the US between them account for about half of world trade. Negotiators said at the outset of these agreements that this would set a blueprint for all future world trade. There is no global south country participating in those negotiations, yet the standards that come out of it will be the standards that those countries have to trade by. And that there has to be a problem with that. And we heard from Clive about some of the different theories for how we've come to this agreement. And it's certainly our understanding that a free trade agreement to be negotiated with China is one of the many reasons for trying to get in a number of the different standards now, because you can't very well ask China to do it if you haven't already set those standards to begin with. And you can see a real sort of drift away that the pro-neoliberal economies like the UK, the EU and the US didn't get what they wanted through the multilateral trading system, which David argued was India's fault in December. It actually wasn't just India's fault. And so they've walked away and they're setting up their own system themselves, and they can do that because their economies are so big. And that's a fundamental flaw in the world trade system, and something we should be actually ashamed of as UK citizens and the EU government, that our representatives are setting up an alternative trade system, bullying southern countries because they can't get what they want in that multilateral system.
I'm going to take 3 questions in just a moment, but I'm going to let Clive just come back on one of those as well.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. I really support part of what Polly's saying, part of what Dave is saying. Academic. That the idea of harmonising standards, converging and then harmonising, I mean, we're doing it all the time. Our Wi-Fi connection wouldn't work if we didn't have global standards for such things. So we have got huge numbers of standards committees working on the International Standards Organisation, working in all sorts of other places as well, with the technical experts working together on these very carefully. It takes a long while to end up with a
Speak up, Clive.
Sorry. It takes a long while to end up with an agreed global standard, but it's happening all the time. And I think on that score I would agree entirely with David, but I disagree with the way it's all being rushed through. So we're trying to get the Directorate General for Trade and the US Trade Representative organising all this themselves and bullying everybody into coming out with some agreements on these standards. I know very early. On the question of bullying, that is probably the biggest thing of all that concerns me about this trade agreement. It's particularly those comments of the US Ambassador, which effectively to me say, okay, yeah, we're going to bully people into accepting our rules as well. And it's particularly the ISDS, which is the biggest concern for me on that. And there was an observation by a research institution in the United States, which identified an extremely low likelihood that American and European companies will be suing each other.
You have to speak up, Clive. I don't think you can hear. Is the microphone not working?
It might not.
You try that one.
No. But I'm sorry about that. Leave that at that. I don't want to take too much time on that.
Okay.
But ISDS, the suggestion is that the reason that that is in there is almost, and this is a suggestion from the United States government, the main reason it is there is not so that United States companies can sue us and vice versa. It is so you get money to deal with China.
Okay, thank you. Right, lots of hands going up, so we're going to take 3. You had your hand up first. Thanks for being very patient.
Hello, Hilda Palmer, Greater Manchester Hazard Centre. And I'd really like to take up the point about deregulation. I think there's no way we cannot see this as deregulation. I think it also helps to look at it as more about an issue between corporations trying to control this agreement rather than between the EU and Europe. And I think what people need to realise is that in the UK, over the last 4 years, we've had the most massive deregulatory sort of moves which are going on globally, and that has been pushed into Europe, and we now have all regulations in Europe being reviewed under the REFIT programme, and I think you can see that all as being actually preparatory to what's going on. And the difference in regulations on, particularly on chemicals, which certainly American companies absolutely hated and held up the REACH regulations, which Polly was talking about. This is another way of them having a go at this. I think we must all not be naive enough to really not understand what corporations are trying to do. On health and safety in this country, corporations are now absolutely ruling the roost, and they have completely overturned the regulations that we had.
I'm going to go right to the back, because you had your hand up before? Didn't quite get one. Should do.
Please would all those using the mic hold it just like a lollipop that's just enough to think.
That's better, isn't it? On the way there. So.
Hiya. Do you think TTIP is a response to the waning position of the US dollar as a world reserve currency vis-a-vis the BRICS nations?
You had your hand up before.
My question is for the person from the College of Europe. Basically, as you said, TTIP is not really exciting as a trade agreement. So I researched into the promotional discourse by the Commission, and I'm just wondering, like, do you think that the way the Commission is selling the TTIP is a way to overcome a sort of legitimacy crisis that happened with the ACTA thing, with its inability to respond to the 2008 crisis and also to Barroso? So yeah, so this is my...
Yeah, thank you very much. Three very, very good questions. And I will come back to you guys later who all had your hands up.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for some very good questions. Let me in a sense, or comments. Let me start off with Hilda's comments, and this is something I left out in my initial talk, partly because there wasn't time, but I think there's an inherent bias when you're talking about trade negotiations, certainly towards deregulation, because the emphasis, when you talk, the way these regulations are painted in the negotiations is as non-tariff barriers, so that's the technical term for a lot of these regulations. Or differences in regulation between the US and the EU. So when you're starting to talk about these things as non-tariff barriers to trade, you're talking about them as impediments, things you should get rid of. And there may be very good reasons for having, very different standards here than in the United States. So, obviously the outcome of the negotiations we don't know yet. The negotiations are ongoing, so the extent of deregulation depends. And I think when you're talking about something like public services like the NHS, it's not about necessarily new market access. Although it depends, whether a negative list is used with the ratchet clause, but that's a more technical point. The more basic point is about locking in, existing liberalisation when it comes to the NHS. So it's about, entrenching deregulation. And more broadly, when you talk about, regulations as non-tariff barriers, clearly, the movement is in one direction. How far, whether it's an inch in that direction or 50 yards, remains to be seen, of course. But yeah, the bias is definitely there. Omar, who's a former student of mine, I'm going to embarrass him now, at the back. A very interesting question. I mean, I'm not an expert on finance, so I'd frame this very much more in terms of, this is, I think, something that Clive touched upon when he was talking about, the geopolitics of TTIP. There is that geopolitical angle, and more broadly, it is about the waning position, particularly of the EU, but also of the US vis-a-vis China. And so, TTIP is very, this is a key motivation. You don't want to be left behind, in a position where your influence is potentially waning. This is, sort of almost, some people refer to it as a sort of last gasp attempt at, shaping the, global economic governance. But, my argument would be that, in a way, it risks ostracizing, players like China and other BRIC nations who, may not wish to be as cooperative as they've been in the past. Actually, China's been quite a willing participant. And anyway, let me turn to the final question. And this is something I've been working quite a bit about. About how the TTIP's been sold, and what the Commission has done is it's used the same strategy it has in the past, which is to talk up the economic benefits, talk up the benefits of liberalising. In a sense, part of that's reflected in what David was saying today. And that in the past worked very well when it was trying to sell, for example, the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which you probably have maybe heard less about. That was a very controversial agreement. It came up for ratification at the start of the sort of economic crisis in Europe, at a time where the automobile sector, which was very much against the agreement, was very mobilized and strong. This was at the time of the cash for clunkers schemes, right, in Germany and Britain. And so this is a time when the automobile industry was quite strong, and yet the Commission was able to neutralize them by saying, well, you guys are just protectionists and you're ignoring all the economic benefits that derive from the agreement. And what you see here is that strategy, in a way, is backfired. Just talking about, broad economic benefits from, as we've heard from Clive here, what are potentially quite dubious studies. Well, I wouldn't say they're potentially quite dubious, I think they are quite dubious. That's backfired because people have been able to talk in terms of, the threat to democracy, the threat to hard-fought social and environmental protections. They've been able to talk in terms of broader values. And so, they're very much, I think, the advocates of TTIP on the back foot for that reason. I hope that answers the question anyway.
Okay. I'm going to take more questions because this is really good. I'll come to you in a second. Thanks for so much hands going up. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a question from a journalist, Kevin Gopal.
Apologies for being a journalist, thanks Michael. Kevin Gopal from The Big Issue in the North. And thank you to the speakers for some interesting talks. I'd welcome their comments on 2 points, really. The first is, in the run-up to the start of the TTIP negotiations, there were 127 meetings, I believe, that the European Commission had with stakeholders. Of those, 93%, it said, were with corporations and only 7% with trade unions and NGOs. The second point, please, is the ISDS provisions. And whilst, David, you acknowledged that the ability of overseas companies to sue governments was controversial, perhaps it's little known that this is not through the mainstream courts, but ISDS is actually run through a series of arbitration panels of corporate lawyers. So it's just to ask you comments on those 2 points. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kevin. I'll just bring the microphone round. I have. What money?
Thanks for coming and talking to us today. Just want to make a quick comment on the sort of regulations. And it's interesting that REACH, which is this chemical regulation within the EU, which is actually quite good as a precautionary principle, forces US arms companies to not be able to put certain chemicals in their arms because they can't sell them in the European market. So actually, without this agreement, we're kind of getting better protection than we potentially would be with it. And that's just an interesting twist of what's happening at the moment. So can people comment? So I guess I got a question for David. Can the UK government guarantee that this sort of harmonisation of regulations will be a race to the top? As a citizen of this country, I want that agreement to give me that guarantee. If it's not going to give me that guarantee, that's not something I want, and I don't understand how I can put my democratic view across to this agreement that's happening with the European Commission, where European MEPs don't even really get much of a say on the negotiations against Parliament. Like, the whole thing seems a farce.
This is a question for David. Sorry to keep asking questions, but you said that it would be good for small to medium enterprises, but I just wanted to sort of point to the track record of free trade and the impacts it tends to have on small to medium local enterprises in developing countries and stuff, and say that maybe it would make it easier for small to medium enterprises to trade across the Atlantic, but would it make it easier for them to trade at home, or would it lead to multinational corporations from the US out-competing them at home because they can compete easier due to economies of scale?
Thank you. Could the panel please explain, explain in how far the UK is going to be a clear winner in the TTIP competition, and that there is a number of European member countries who are going to be quite badly off, and they're going to suffer an adverse impact from it.
So, David Henig, if I could come to you first. You seem to be put on the spot again.
Right, hang on. Where do we got to? Special ISDS courts. That's correct. At the moment they are held in they're in secret as well. That's true as well. One of the reforms that is proposed by the Commission is to make those transparent and to allow representations to be made, which isn't the case at the moment. There is a real debate going on as to whether ISDS, what should happen with ISDS. Should it be in there? Should it not be in there? What form of ISDS should be in there? How do you reform it? There's a real debate going on. There was a consultation earlier on this year. We're expecting outcomes January, and lots of people are contacting their MPs and their MAPs to give their views. That's all I can say. Meetings with lobbyists, yes, that was until 3 months before the talks started. Those figures were produced. I can't really comment on them. They were produced by the Commission. All I know is the Commission's been making a lot of efforts to meet whoever asks it for a meeting, whether it's NGOs or companies or whoever, since the start of talks. And there are huge amounts of stakeholder activities going on, involving many organisations, businesses, NGOs, etc. Guarantees, yeah, it's okay. Can I guarantee it? Fred is slightly above my pay grade. No, what I can say about Bridge, interesting, okay, I can say two things. One is the UK government is pushing for, there's been a bit of a debate about transparency. We are actually pushing for more things to be published, including the details of the regulatory proposals when they actually are some, which they aren't there yet, ahead of the full text, so that you will actually be able to see them ahead of the full text, as will MPs, MEPs, etc., and will be able to actually comment and be able to judge whether that has been met or not. So, I can't guarantee it, but I can say that we're pushing for you to be actually able to see it, because we recognise that if you can see it, you'll be able to make that judgment, and hopefully you'll make the judgment that it's right and not it's keeping standards, not lowering them. But you know, proof of the pudding will be in an eating, and we haven't got that far yet. Pudding's not been baked.
Small and medium-sized.
Small and medium-sized enterprise. I don't see that because US multinational enterprises, EU there's a lot of multinational enterprises we know about. There has been a concentration of capital, as it's called. Some of you will be familiar with this with this theory. It kind of dates back to Marx, but there has been a rise of multinational enterprises and a squeeze on smaller companies, and some of that has been put down to the fact that it's easier for multinational enterprises to meet regulations. And to meet differing regulations. So you actually should be giving more of a chance, and you know, the argument is always in the reverse way, is that small and medium enterprises can be more nimble than larger enterprises, and therefore can face that competition down. Final point, will the UK be a winner, others loser? Well, I've talked to a lot of different EU countries, representatives from them. There is, as far as I know, there is no EU country at the moment that is against TTIP or that thinks they're going to lose out from it. That's all I can say.
Do you want to come back?
Speak up, pretend the microphone's a lollipop. Got it. The lady who gave the advice, is that okay? Can you hear? Brilliant. So, firstly, what you've just heard on the investor-state dispute settlement rules, the fact that there is a chance that it might be modified, reformed, or come out of the deal altogether is nothing less than the result of the campaigning that all of you have been doing, and that's brilliant. 150,000 people across Europe responded to the EU's rushed consultation on ISDS, which is a testament itself, because if you took part in it, you'll see that you probably needed to have studied at the University of Manchester and done a PhD in economics to understand some of the questions. But 50,000 of those responses came from the UK. What's interesting, though, I think, is originally we heard we were going to get an analysis of that consultation back in November. We just heard it will be January. But regardless of the strength of feeling about it, the number of people who took part, the UK government is still committed to including ISDS in the deal. And that's a real concern. And it also relates to another point about I want to make on evidence, which is the negotiations began on TTIP before a sustainability impact assessment had been done to look at what the potential impacts could be. We've been asking about this for many months. It's been started. It also was meant to report now in November, but nobody seems to know when it's going to report. And I ask you to consider how you can be negotiating and making progress on the talks while you still don't know what the sustainability impact will be. That seems to me the entirely wrong way to be undertaking trade negotiations. And that same point on evidence goes for the impact on small and medium enterprises. There's a consultation ongoing at the moment. I think very much advocates of TTIP would love to be able to show how small and medium enterprises really want this deal. But currently there is no evidence to show that. Every time we ask, we just hear anecdotally, like I think you said the perfume manufacturer wants it. Well, great for the perfume manufacturer. I'm really happy for them, but there are a lot of other people who might be very concerned about the deal. So there's a real issue about evidence here. What other questions did we have that it's worth picking up on quickly? I think, Kevin, you made some very good points about access of corporations to the negotiators. We've got a list which will be public as soon as it gets around people's hands of the meetings that the UK civil servants have had with business groups. I'm told it's long and many familiar faces, so please look out for that as soon as we can circulate it. But it really does demonstrate that business has had the most extraordinary access to negotiators in a way that civil society groups haven't had. And it goes even to the extent that the British and American Business Lobby Group has been funding and providing the secretariat for the all-party group of MPs on TTIP, a pro-TTIP group, which includes MPs from all different parties, but is specifically there to promote TTIP in Parliament. Now, we would love to be able to have an all-party group raising concerns about TTIP or opposing TTIP, but we don't have the resources to run a secretariat, and it's very hard at the moment, given lots of the concerns about lobbying in the UK, to even set up an all-party group at all. I'd be quite interested to know the detail of how that even came about.
I'm going to take some more questions if that's all right, because there's loads of hands going up. You've had your hand up for ages.
I'm glad to hear someone bring up the climate a few cycles ago. And on the subject of the climate, climate scientists have told us that we need to leave most of our fossil fuel reserves in the ground. Now, leaving aside the probability of anything of that happening anytime soon, under an agreement like this, maybe if we don't know the specifics, under the precedent of similar agreements, would it be legally possible with these dispute resolution mechanisms to decide not to develop fossil fuel resources or to stop developing resources that have been begun?
Okay, good question.
I'd like to say more a comment for discussion than a question. I'm a Portuguese national. My country suffers for the last 3 years strong austerity imposed by the IMF, Commission and ECB Troika, as you probably know. And it's funny that I think there's a mindset behind this, that is the Commission mindset, political mindset. These ISTS mechanisms, I'm not an expert on this, but it's funny to see that the Commission itself is working as a corporate against its own states. The example is the Veolia Egyptian case in which Veolia sued the state. In this case, the Commission, not IMF, the Commission is suing Portugal because they rose the minimum wage by 20 euros a month. And so the new mindset that's behind this is the problem, and shouldn't we be discussing? And it's funny because now we have the first commission, I believe, which was somehow elected, to see if this kind of agreements, this kind of political mindsets would be possible under this more representative condition.
Thanks very much. Excuse my laryngitis. My point kind of links to the previous speaker's one to a certain extent, which is advocates of initiatives such as this are very fond of encouraging free trade. What they're less enthusiastic about is the ability of people to organise together in order to negotiate improvements to their wages, terms and conditions and pensions. In the United States, for example, pretty well half the states now have passed anti-trade union legislation. There is widespread perception that trade union protections of wages and improved working standards are seen as an impediment to trade and development. And so, and as the previous speaker pointed out, the EU Commission hasn't been slow in imposing and emasculating trade unions in member states. So my question is, isn't this going to result in a race to the bottom? Isn't it going to condemn the EU and particularly the UK to a permanent low-wage economy?
All right, we'll take one more question.
Thank you. Sorry to add another to the list, but I just wanted to come back to the issue of environmental impact assessments. I work in energy. I've been a practitioner for over 7 years here. I'm also doing a PhD. I've done a bit of consultancy, so I know how it works in industry. And to be honest, on the ground, and even as these things are being developed, they're often little more than box-checking exercises that are just rubber stamping a decision that's already been made, particularly the way that it's done. Particularly if the impact assessments are done at the end of the process rather than at the beginning and iterated throughout. So I'd be very concerned about whether or not this has actually been taken up into the decision-making process. So if that could be addressed, I'd be grateful.
Okay, no small measures there, all panel. I'll give you all a chance to respond to those points.